Hi, my name is Mateusz and I will share lessons I got from writing my own Angular helper library for reactive forms from Angular. So, as we all know, context is important. Here in the picture we can see that Google is smart enough for guess the context of the end user. Here it is obviously a guy who is having some problems with systems processes. He is not a child murderer. So I don't want you to guess my context, so here it is. I'm Mateusz Chrzonstowski. You can find me anywhere in the internet with either my name and surname or with this nickname like Mat3e. And what else? So this is the only link you should remember after this presentation. So regarding GitHub, it is mat3e.github.io/talks/ll like lessons learned -angular/Angular Warsaw 21.html. So this is this presentation already online. You can track everything which is presented here in the screen. If you don't see anything on this screen, you can use your own laptop. And this is my GitHub account and something about me. So I teach programming in Info Academy. I code for money since 2013, and I started in consulting company, and now I'm in Allegro, and this is probably, you know, this online shop, yeah? And privately I have a lovely family. So I divided my presentation into 5 parts. I will start with the reasons why did I start with my own library. And then I will switch to the library itself and the lessons I've learned from writing it, some general lessons, theoretical knowledge, let's say. Then the main point of this presentation will be lessons regarding Angular framework, our lovely framework. Then lessons regarding other tools like NPM, Webpack, GitHub, and so on. And last but not least, all the marketing trials of my and results of the library. So, why did I start? In order to answer this question, we need to meet more context. So, let's imagine we have 2014. So, this is me, Lederp, and I was right after my first professional IT project written in XJS and Microsoft.NET. So, who from you don't know this XJS library? Lucky you. So for all of you, this you know, it had to be something before Angular, right? And I was right after this project, right before the second project in my professional career, which was in Angular JS, and we had a lot of backend developers, so they were afraid of JavaScript, so we were using also TypeScript. So we were using Angular and TypeScript combo before it was cool, yeah? Before even Google started doing this. And the project was in Java, it was a greenfield project, so I was like that. That was a lovely time. Then 2015, I was still like that, and I got some Pluralsight courses on the tech stack I've mentioned on the previous in the previous year. Yeah, I think I have leveled up after those courses. I was pretty confident, and I've even had some opportunities to participate, to talk during the conferences, for instance CodePod and Lublin Startup Festival. I had talks about Angular and TypeScript and so on. Then the end of 2015, the beginning of 2016, and this is what happened. This is Germany, and this is me. So it can happen when you work for the consulting company that out of nowhere you have to start a totally new project in totally new technology, and you are an expert there. So this is me. Back then I was an expert of systems integration. I was not using anything connected with frontend, so I was using Gosu programming language, which is an alternative JVM language. I was using it to build OData REST services on top of the big insurance system. So that was a hard time for me, but at the end of 2016 and the situation on my project was pretty stable, so I found even some extra time, and I felt motivated to start some side project, something new. So I've started with tech stack I already knew. I started with Angular JS and the UI router, but I was like, screw those are too easy, yeah? And back then, it was almost the day of Angular 2. Back then, Angular was in the 2.0 release candidate 4 version. And I was like, okay, what can happen? Yeah, they were like 30 beta versions, and there was already the 4th version of release candidate. So I was like, I'm getting into that. I'm starting. I did some basic Pluralsight course. I think I got concept pretty well, so I started coding, and then 2.0 release candidate 5 came, and that was a version which introduced modules. So the skeleton, the overall skeleton of my application was just trash, because I had to rewrite it to use modules. So they have introduced modules into Angular, I mean this Angular 2, into 5th release candidate version. And I was like, what? I started digging deeper into Angular. I got to know some other things like webpack, like system.js, RxJS, other things, zones, and so on and so forth. And I was really like shocked because everything changed from what I knew when I got deeper into the topic. And I had to do more Pluralsight courses, and I had to work hard. And by the way, here is the link to a perfect article which can describe the situation presented in this picture. So how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. As far as I remember, I found this article in 2017, but it's pretty perfect, sums up my situation in this picture. And doing some trainings, reading the Angular documentation, I met a topic of dynamic forms, and the dynamic forms topic was something I really appreciated. I thought it is something I want to do in my side project, and that's why I've started a library which at the beginning was an API on top of these dynamic forms mechanisms. So my library, in fact, started being my side project back then. I stopped working on the side project itself. I started working on my library. This is what happened. And then suddenly, April 2017, this what happened. So I mean, this is not like kids happen without any process before, yeah? So I knew that I'm going to have a son, but at the end of April 2016, my son was 17, my son was really born, and I had no other choice, no other option but becoming troll dad. And becoming troll dad is not a piece of cake, it's not an easy thing. So I had to quit my additional activities, and one of the first activities I cut off was my library. And you can ask me now, how about this year? We have 2018, yeah, we have. But I had some more time, obviously. That's why I'm here, for instance, not with my son. But I don't have enough time to work on my library, and to be honest, I've changed my workplace, and currently if I work with frontend, it is either vanilla JS or the library I should not mention by the name at the Angular meetup, right? So I'm not having as much in common with Angular, but I still learned a lot about it. So here we move to DORF, Domain Object Reactive Forms, and let's meet some ideas and motivation I had before starting the library. So as I've said, there was a tutorial on official Angular documentation, dynamic forms. I wanted to simplify all the things presented there, reduce the boilerplate, and last but not least, I didn't want to have any direct connection with CSS frameworks. I wanted to have something independent from CSS. And I wanted a high level of abstraction. And all of this was in order to to serve two motivations, let's say, two kind of motivation. First was an outer motivation, because I had a friend who didn't know much about coding, and I wanted to have this pretty complex domain, pretty complex dynamic forms topic. I wanted to make it pretty easy for him. And that was the outer motivation, the official one, let's say. And the inner one was to have, finally, to have an open source library to see how does it work. And then there was a shock for me. So let's imagine what is our ordinary day at work, and let's combine it or meet it with the creativity. So for the library, it is said for the ordinary day at work that one of the hardest things for software development is to have a good variable name. And here you have to come up with the name for the library, so for the project, for something more. And then it's just the beginning. You have to come up with the idea for the slogan, for the description, for the how-to examples. But on the other hand, you have no pointless meetings, so this is pretty awesome on the other hand. And then there is another topic, which is documentation. And documentation, it's not only about the API, the code itself, it is also the license, the changelog, and all of those things are not the things I personally think of during at the daily basis. So everything can be pretty shocky. And then let's dive into the name itself. So how did I came with this dwarf? So there is a sentence, a thing like reactive forms in Angular, also known as model-driven forms. So this is the opposite of the template-driven forms. And pretty related topic, but a little bit different, is dynamic forms. Yeah. So from those names, I've decided that reactive is the most catchy name. And then there is also domain-driven design, which is a great approach to the software development itself, to the architecture, and this idea is really focused on domains, and each domain has its own domain objects, so the entities, the most important things in this piece of system. So domains was a second thing, and connecting those two, I came up with the name like DORF. Domain Object Reactive Forms. Okay, so mixing those two, I came up with the name. And let's validate this name, right? So Dorf, I already worked on the German project, so I knew that in German it means village, but I was okay with that. Yeah? On the other hand, I know that not every company validates its name before entering the market, and here is the example. This is Pupa Milano. I don't know if any of you have ever bought some cosmetics from them. Personally, I'm a little afraid of this. Yeah? So for those of you who don't speak Polish, I recommend to go for Google Translate. And before coming up with the name, with making the name the official one, you should always go for Google Translate test. And it means you should translate this name at various languages, especially when it is an open source library and it will be available globally. Yeah? You can also use this language detection feature from Google and so on. On the other hand, I can find a counterexample that even the bad name is not a bad result. Yeah? So here we have a company, the name is even worse than Pupa Milano, and it is pretty successful on our market. And I was like pretty fine with my name. I thought this is a great library name, and then in 2018, when I didn't maintain my library, I got an issue like that. Nice lip, ugly name. So fortunately, the guy quickly changed the title to circular references, which is not true, by the way, but my heart was broken. Okay, so the name was the first thing, and the second thing was documentation. And let's dive into how the documentation in open source project is related with the documentation in the Agile project. So at some point in time, I have downloaded scores of free ebooks, especially connected with microservices, from O'Reilly, free ebooks from O'Reilly. And all the bullet points in this slide will be from the 20-page report, like Getting Started with Inner Source by Andy Oram. And this is a really great report. It describes the transformation at PayPal, and some points from this are like that. So Agile was especially for the communication, face-to-face communication. Yeah. On the other hand, open source developers are really into the quality, and also they have full documentation. All those things are connected with the distribution. The teams which work on the open source are distributed teams. You don't have a chance to have a quick chat during a morning coffee and go through all the pain points or topics at the project. You have to really document just everything. And then anyone remembers what Agile tells about the documentation? What does Agile tell? There is a point in Agile Manifesto which tells working software over documentation. And then another consequence of those distributed team is that English is the lingua franca for those teams. And also, let's think about the Angular. Yeah, there were like 30 beta versions. Previously there were alpha versions. There was really candidates mentioned on the slide, in the previous slides. Yeah, so that was pretty old-fashioned way of putting Angular 2 in the world. This is not the agile way. So the work on the open source project is totally different thing. And then those were rather theoretical things, and now let's focus on the practical things. So I was building a library, and I was focused on the best practices I knew already from my professional career, but I wanted to put them on the slide, and then I was like, whoa, this is something like Solid, but at the library level. So Solid is a well-known principle when it comes to the software development, but I found it really useful also for the library level. So S from Solid stands for single responsibility principle. So it means that if you do a library, you just have to follow this principle, because a library is not a framework. It should focus just on one particular thing. And then O from Solid stands for open-close principle, which means the solution should be open for the extension, but closed for the modification. And for the library, I think it's not only the extension, but also the configuration. And what does it mean in particular for my library, for instance? So here we have what should be done in order to support a new form field in the dynamic form. So here is the star rating field, and in order to add such a field, you have to extend just 3 base classes like definition, metadata, component. You don't have to modify any code from my library. All the mechanisms works on the abstractions, and following those abstractions, you are just ready to go. Yeah. So this is what should be done also at the library level. And L stands for Miss Liskov substitution principle. And this, for the software development, means that it should be easy to switch from a class to its subclasses and so on and so forth. And this is the hardest point for the library, how to match this Liskov substitution principle. But I've already presented that I had this base idea of not having a direct connection with any CSS framework. So I have discovered, I did something like a placeholders for CSS classes. You could put classes from any CSS framework. So I had something like a meta framework, and this is something I can say follows the Liskov substitution principle. Then we have an I letter, which is for interface segregation principle. In short words, it means that Many small specialized interfaces are better than one general one which does everything. So I've already mentioned that for door field you have to implement definition, metadata, component, small specialized building blocks, not one general thing. And the letter stands for dependency inversion principle, which means pluggability. We should not have connections, direct connections between modules. We should base on some level of abstraction. And for my library, I had high goals. I wanted to have a really good modular design. I didn't achieve all the goals I wanted to achieve, but still I got a pretty flexible structure. Now we should have lessons regarding Angular. This is the main point of the presentation, let's say. So let's play a game, yeah? I tell you Angular, and first 3 associations, first 3 thoughts you have regarding this framework. Come on. Components, yeah? Forms, this is not exactly what I wanted to hear, but okay. So here are my main associations I came up with. So decorators, then TypeScript, and then, as far as I think, this is the official logo of web components, because this is what I found when googling for web components. Okay, so let's dive into each one of those 3 and see what I have learned in this topic, in each of those topics regarding during writing my library. So when it comes to decorators, so I discovered that decorators are just specific functions, yeah, because what else they can be in JavaScript, yeah. I really wanted to have a design like Angular. I wanted to have a lot of decorators, so I dive into the topic and I've just learned it. So in order to implement a decorator like a door form with those open braces, you have to create something like that. The function which accepts the constructor. This is for the class level decorator, and you can also have property level decorators, as you probably know from Angular. So in order to implement this class level, you have to create a function which accepts the constructor, because the class behind the scenes in JavaScript is a pure constructor. So having this constructor, you can then modify it. I was modifying the prototype of this constructor. In fact, I was adding additional properties in my, let's say, library logic. And in order to have those braces here, you have to wrap your function, which accepts the constructor, with some kind of wrapping function. And this wrapping function can accept all the options, configuration properties, and this is how Angular also did this. So what happens behind the scenes when having such a construction? You are executing a function, you are eventually passing some options inside, and this returns another function to you which accepts a constructor. And when TypeScript meets this @ sign, it just executes the function it gets with the constructor which is down below. Yeah? So this is how decorators at the class level are implemented. And then we have this second level of the property decorator. And as I've said, in Angular we have an input parameter, input decorator, which is for the properties which has to be maintaining by the component. And for implementing such a thing, you need a function which accepts not 1 but 2 arguments. First is the prototype, and the second one is a decorated property name. So this is what you need, and what I wanted to do with this class level decorator, I wanted to have it above the component decorator in Angular, and with this door object input decorator, I wanted to have an input functionality enhanced by my logic. So I wanted to really use this Angular input behind the scenes and do something more. So how did I do this? So here we have Dwarf object input accepts, this is the first function, which then returns the target function with a prototype and the name. Inside this function, this wrapped function executes input as TypeScript does normally behind the scenes, and passing two things like prototype and name, because this is what literally happens in our code written at daily basis with Angular and TypeScript. And then after this Angular logic, I had my own logic. Yeah? With target prototype dwarf object in form, I was adding additional property, just like that. One more thing, maybe, in order to have an annotation without those braces, you would have to write something like that. So function without any wrappers, and then the name, like for instance dwarf form. Because what TypeScript expects is the reference to the function which should be executed with constructor or with prototype and name. But if you want an options, you have no other option than wrapping the function. Okay. And at the beginning, at some alpha and beta versions, Angular had both view and component annotations, decorators. So it was already, let's say, ready for multiple decorators at the component level. So those dwarf form decorators were just working. Then we have components, and what I've learned regarding components. So as we all know, components make you focus on building blocks, but I wanted to have abstract component class just to make the extension of my library easier for the end users. So how to create a base class and to use some decorators? It is possible. It is just possible. The trick is of not having component annotation at the base class, but you can have it on, or you should have it on all the subclasses, yeah? And inside this abstract component, you can just go with everything you want, yeah? So I was having a field like metadata, which was generic type, and I was using an input annotation on it, and it was working for all the subclasses, yeah? Here we can make it easier for the presentation. And just have this, yeah. So take a photos now, not previously. Okay. Then we have a TypeScript. As I've said, this is a piece, a really important piece of Angular. Let's say version 2. And TypeScript makes you focus on the API, understood as fields and methods. So I've discovered that it's really great to use as many typing as you can. So here is an enum, let's say, definition. I was using interfaces, I was using generic types, extending other interfaces, and so on and so forth. And here is a nice example of how TypeScript is powerful when it comes to typing, static typing. Let's imagine this DOM object is a class. It is in fact a generic class here, but let's imagine this is a class which has like two fields, which is name and ID. And name is a type of string and ID is a type of number. And key of class means, in our example, it will be either name or ID. And this construction, so class out of key of class, will be either, in our case, name, not name, either string or number. So it is a really powerful construction, which then makes your assignments pretty safe and compile time checked. Then for ahead of time compilation for TypeScript, you have to really be careful with all the question marks, for instance, because these Elvis operators are nice when writing base classes, but then when you want to return a type which was defined with the question mark, you have to use the union type like number or undefined, yeah? So you have to be careful with those. And then this is having all those good typings and things, it is easy to generate a documentation, and I found this typedoc documentation generator even better than existing Angular generators for the documentation back then. maybe now it is not so actual, but it is still worth thinking about typedoc as one of your main generators. Okay, so now let's go quickly through other tools. I've learned a lot also about them. So Webpack and Karma. First thing I've learned that Angular CLI hides a lot, and I can't create a library with the Angular CLI because I wanted my library to be used in all the applications with Angular CLI. Built with Angular CLI. So I've learned that this powerful command line interface hides a lot. And in order to simulate some things from this CLI, I have created a special dedicated directory which was config at the Dorf level of directories. Then I had the 3 other subdirectories, Karma, TypeScript, Webpack, and each of those directories had a separate let's say configuration for tests, for production, for development. So those were separate files inside separate documentation, and that was helpful when it comes to organizing all those things. And here's the example for package.json. I can use Karma with dedicated config, and then inside this dedicated config of Karma I can use a dedicated Webpack configuration, and this helped me a bit. Then about GitHub, what I've learned, so continuous integration. I always wanted to have something like that at my GitHub repository, and I've discovered that it is super easy to do so. There is Travis, which is a continuous integration tool for GitHub. You can just sign in this tool with your GitHub account, then all your repositories will be already attached then there. And this is enough to add a predefined build script for Node.js, and then every time you commit something to your repository on the master branch or merge something there, Travis is executing its logic in the cloud, and you are ready to get the results from the build from Travis. And how to put this nice image? You have to use batch, and there is a web page like shields.io which is specialized for GitHub, which is doing GitHub badges out of the box, let's say. You have to copy a markdown and use some Travis URLs from your project, and you are ready to go. Then there is a web page which is also possible with GitHub. You can have a docs folder on the master branch, and this plus your repository like username.github.io, it is enough to have a static content web page. You can use then to host your documentation. Then Readme file. It is really important to make it nice for all the users, because this is the first thing they see. So badges should be at the top of this. Then you should have a quick win or a short example of how to play with your library, how your library changes other guys' lives, and then you have to have more and more examples, especially the online ones. And at the end you can have some links to the documentation articles, probably written by you at the beginning. Then what I've learned about Node and NPM, those things work some kind of differently than GitHub. So Readme is displayed in a different manner, especially when it comes to code pieces in the Readme file. Then there is something like npm ignore. By default it is exactly what git ignore is, but it should not be the case. So when you get Angular, for instance, as a Node module, you are not getting all the TypeScript definition files. You are all the TypeScript source code files. You are just getting the TypeScript definition files and JavaScript compiled outputs from the TypeScript source files. So you should not ignore DTS files and dist folder, but you should ignore TypeScript. So this is an opposite of git ignore, in fact. And then right after publishing a new version, you are getting plenty of downloads. This is a huge knowledge you should use wisely. Then the more frequent you update, the better position you have in search results. It's not only the matter of the keywords, this is rather more how much you maintain your library. This is the thing which really helps being visible. Then you have a semantic versioning, which really helps you thinking about backward compatibility. So I have an example here how it helped me with modules, but lessons learned is that this backward compatibility can really affect your design decisions. Okay, let's move on. Marketing. So how I tried to promote my library. So you should use Twitter, obviously. You should, if you don't have Twitter, just start having it. And there is a pro tip that 2 hashtags per post is the best visibility. Then there is the same founder of Twitter found also a Medium, which is for articles, while Twitter is for short posts. Yeah, so those two cooperate pretty well. But you should also be visible on Medium. So I had some articles on how to write dynamic forms, and I was demonstrating my library there. I even got some likes and so on and so forth. Clubs on Medium, there are clubs. Okay, and then I was trying to comment the tutorials on the reactive forms about reactive forms in Angular, and then the most time-consuming thing, but the most effective one when it comes to attracting the users. So this is Stack Overflow. You should every day I was looking for the questions regarding reactive, model-driven, dynamic forms in Angular. I was answering them, and I was linking my library somewhere there. Okay, so I've summed up everything of how to get a user and what are the user needs in a table like that. There are 5 priorities, and the first priority, the most important thing, is to being visible at npm.js. How to do this, I've already mentioned. You should have frequent updates. Then you should have a nice readme, because when someone enters your module at npm.js, your package, you should attract him with a quick win and online examples. I've already mentioned this as well. Then the documentation, it should be existing and visible, just in case, because we know as developers we don't like writing the documentation, but personally I would not probably use Angular without its perfect documentation. So documentation, just in case, it is really important for the end users. Then you should provide downloadable examples, because online examples are good for having a user, and then everyone wants to, if it is really into the library, he wants to play with some code in his favorite IDE, which is usually Webster. So those downloadable examples should be inside the repo itself, and then clean source code. From the developer's perspective, this is the most important things. If you have contributors, it is important, but for the end user, for the majority of the end users, it is the less important part. But on the other hand, it can help you generate the documentation. And what were the results of my library? So I got 7 GitHub stars. Those were my first starts ever, so I was pretty happy with this number. Anyway, over almost a year ago, I got 1,000 downloads in a single day, which was also pretty awesome. And even after stopping maintaining my library, I had like 300 or 400 downloads a month. It was before Angular 5, which make my library now my library is not working with Angular 5, but it was working back then, and so I had like 300 downloads. And even now, if it is not working, despite it is not working, I'm having like 100 downloads a month. And that gave me a huge knowledge growth. First of all, I understood, maybe it seems obvious, but I understood that the authors of the library are the same software developers as we are. I also find out all the lessons I've shared with you about the new approach, about different priorities in the open source project, and I really understand Angular pretty well, especially its narrow part. So to sum up, here is the screen from the Kurora question, and in order to stand out, in order to not being accused of just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow, you have to do something more. I'm not telling everyone should write its own library, should write its own framework, But at some point in time, regarding AngularJS, there was a pretty popular tutorial, which was learn AngularJS by writing your own light version of this framework. Yeah. It was awesome, but you don't need as much influence in open source. You just can have a simple contribution, like update the documentation, provide additional example, use example of the library. You will still get involved into the process. You will have to follow some contribution process. You will get an approve from the important project contributor, and it will still give you a lot. And then GitHub, Twitter, Medium, Stack Overflow. Let's have a quick game. How many of you use Stack Overflow? Don't lie to me, everyone uses it. And how many of you upvote a correct answer they use at work after using the answer? How many of you upvotes it? See, even simple upvoting makes you an elite. It makes you a part of the elite members of GitHub, Twitter, and Stack Overflow. On GitHub you have stars, on Twitter you have likes, on Medium claps, and on Stack Overflow upvotes. So that's all from my side. Thank you all for your attention. We can have a quick chat afterwards, and now let's move on to the next presentation. Thank you.